Exercise is an increased demand for energy. It makes an exceptional demand on your body systems, your circulation, your respiratory system, temperature and regulatory systems, and most importantly, the body's fuel supply. The magnitude of these demands depends on the severity of the exercise. So the question then is, how do you assess demands? So first of all, you have to quantitate the exercise. So there's several ways you can do it. You can measure the rate at which oxygen is being consumed in mils of oxygen per kilogram per minute. And 3.5 mils of oxygen per kilogram per minute is 1 MET, or 1 metabolic equivalent of task. Another way to do it is exercise intensity, measured as a percentage of max oxygen uptake. That's your VO2 max. And then you can measure the actual physical work being done in watts or joules. And also heart rate is commonly used as a measure of the intensity of work. And then that leads you to this sort of chart, which states the physical activity as a number of METs. So sleeping is slightly less than 1 MET, and watching TV is barely better as physical activity, increasing it only by 0.1%. So watching TV is 1. And then writing, work, just moving around a bit more, is 1.8. Walking is between 2.3 and 2.9. And then moderate intensity increases the METs. Cycling on a stationary bike is 3 METs, walking is 3.3. And then 50 watts of cycling, then you get up to 5.5 METs, which is not quite twice as much as 50 watts of cycling. And then vigorous intensity exercises, jogging, 7 METs, calisthenics, running, and rope jumping, then all higher with vigorous intensity. As I mentioned, exercise puts a much larger demand on your body's energy, and the result is changes within the muscle cells. Now, up until this point, we've talked about how increased glucose uptake into muscle cells, into the liver cells, into the adipose tissue is done by an insulin-dependent mechanism, and that is insulin binding to a plasma membrane bound receptor causes increase in PI3 kinase that then makes GLUT4 vesicles translocate to the membrane surface of the muscle cell, and then glucose is uptaken in a rapid fashion and then utilized within the cell for usually storage with insulin stimulation. However, when you exercise, obviously sympathetic stimulation is inherent, and that's going to suppress insulin release. And so the muscle cells, which clearly have a larger demand for glucose when they're being used, need another mechanism to get the required substrate into the cell. And in order to achieve this, you have insulin-independent glucose uptake. What happens is during muscle exertion, so you get the signal coming in, you get release of calcium from the stores, which is inherent and central to muscle contraction. And then this promotes GLUT4 vesicles moving to the membrane in an insulin-independent fashion. And that way the muscle still gets this facilitated diffusion of glucose into the muscle, but through insulin-independent factors. And other changes happen within the skeletal muscle that is again involved or due to rises in intracellular calcium, and you get substrate utilization due to a change in biochemical controls that enable muscle glycogenolysis and increased lipid use to begin without hormone secretion. And so during exercise, the muscle starts moving. This automatically incorporates more GLUT4 transporters onto the membrane, and the biochemistry of the cell changes automatically, independently of insulin, to ensure that there's enough glucose, enough energy to do what the muscle wants to. During exercise, activation of the sympathetic nervous system increases hormones, particularly the catecholamines. And what this does is it inhibits insulin release and stimulates glucagon production. The sympathetic stimulation does. And then with the catecholamines that are released dependent on the level of your exercise increase, and this will reinforce that decrease in insulin, increase in glucagon, which will result in the mobilization of lipid and carbohydrate sources. So you'll get increased muscle and liver glycogenolysis, you get increased adipose lipolysis, and your free fatty acids may actually increase to about 400% more than what your normal triglyceride levels are. And you can see here in this graph how the changes in the glucagon and insulin plasma concentrations change with exercise, and the longer you exercise for, the greater this difference is, with insulin falling away and glucagon being promoted. The metabolites that your body will use during exercise depends on both the duration and the intensity of the exercise. For short bursts of activity, glycogenolysis is important. And with this duration of exercise being 40 minutes, you have a reasonable amount of muscle glycogen being used and plasma glucose being used, plasma free fatty acids. But as the exercise goes on longer and longer, you see that the muscle glycogen falls away and the plasma free fatty acids get used more in its place. And then these arrows essentially support what I just said. Your glycogen is used up over 2 hours, and free fatty acids become the predominant fuel over this period. And glucose contribution increases and then returns to a lower level. Intensity of your exercise will also change what sources you use. With short bursts, you're basically using ATP and creatine phosphates as your energy. And then with a little bit longer, it's anaerobic glycolysis from muscle glycogen. And then with prolonged exercise, is predominantly going to be through aerobic oxidation, as you use your muscle glycogen up, your plasma glucose, your liver glycogen. There also will be a lot of fats used in this, as we saw previously. And then for really prolonged exercise, such as a marathon, you're going to use a lot of aerobic oxidation. Your plasma-free fatty acids are going to be high, and this is going to be your predominant fuel type. During exercise, hepatic glucose output may actually rise about 500%. Plasma fuel concentrations may rise slightly, even though muscle glucose uptake increases 20 to 30 times. And exercise can increase your total energy expenditure by about 5 to 10 fold. So the regulation of hormones during exercise is influenced by many factors, including age, intensity of your workout, duration of your workout, time of day, your gender, temperature, and your overall fitness levels. But there's a pattern to it, and these next couple of slides is based on about 70% of VO2 max, and you can see what your body does on the onset of exercise, and then how this cascade of hormonal changes progresses through your activity. So with initiation, you get peripheral nervous system afferents to the central nervous system, activating your sympathetic nervous system, and that's going to signal the adrenal medulla, and you get sympathetic spillover of norepinephrine, but also release of epinephrine into the system. And then these will signal the skeletal muscle to start breaking down glycogen further, and you get vasoconstriction in areas where you don't have metabolites causing vasodilation, etc. And you'll get sympathetic stimulation of the pancreas, then reduces insulin release and increases glucagon release, and this then reinforces epinephrine's effect on both glycogen lysis and lipolysis. And then so with continuous sympathetic stimulation, you go into the second phase, and the hypothalamus begins secreting corticotrophin releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, and thyrotropin releasing hormone. And the first one to act is ACTH, and that gets released, and you start getting cortisol released from the adrenal medulla. And then this stimulates more proteolysis to create, and gluconeogenesis to create more glucose from the third fuel source, from proteins. And then you come to the third phase, which is kind of complicated, and other hormones from the pituitary regulate responses of the sympathetic adrenal axis. Muscles begin to release cytokines and other agents into the circulation to further regulate the response to exercise. And you get vasopressin being released, an atrial natriuretic peptide, which will regulate your volume, your blood volume, to make sure that your blood pressure remains high. And cytokines will also be involved in this to a certain extent, and this just generally helps then your body deal with this stress of exercise. After all this, then you have recovery that is usually biphasic, with an initial recovery within minutes and a more sustained recovery to rest in homeostasis that lasts several hours. And the severity of your exercise is going to determine the length of recovery. And what you'll notice in this graph is how almost all hormones are modulated by intensity, and is usually with an increase. So if we see ACTH, anticipation actually causes an increase in ACTH, which would release cortisol, and this is like you're getting ready for something. Your body will prime itself with the release of cortisol, and that will encourage catecholamine release, and so your glycogen stores presumably will be filling up due to proteolysis and gluconeogenesis, and your general nervous anticipation primes you for activity. But with short-term submaximal, you get an increase in ACTH, catecholamines, and cortisol, glucagon and growth hormone. But obviously, insulin is the one that is suppressed with activity across the board. High intensity is then going to increase these even further, and prolonged exercise also results in a large increase in virtually all of these. And then aerobic training, which in this case is very light intensity, probably just a fast walk or maybe even less than that, a lot of these hormones are actually reduced in the other direction, apart from growth hormone, which seems to be stimulated by any kind of physical activity. This graph shows you how epinephrine is released depending on the intensity of the exercise, and the more intense your activity is, the greater release of epinephrine. And cortisol too has a kind of a biphasic, as we talked about in that previous graph, where light intensity exercise reduces cortisol. So too we see here with low VO2 max, you get low release of, or a reduction in cortisol, and then with high intensity exercise, it's stimulated more and more due to the stress of the exercise.